Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. This is Dan Pertel. We're going to give it one more minute as our last few participants join. So we'll start in about 1 minute. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to Delivering Supply Chain Resilience Through Instruments of Trust. This is a blockchain use case that we're going to go through today. Next slide, I'd like to present our speakers for today. Shelley Shervin is the SCM Program Manager with BSI. She's somebody that I've worked with for about 20 years. And she leads a team of people that manage a software called Supplier Compliance Manager, which is a risk-based methodology for assessing suppliers and global supply chains for themes like CTPAT, European Union, Authorized Economic Operator, social responsibility programs, forced labor, child labor programs, business continuity. It's a whole slew of different technology that she works with and themes of audits that she's overseeing. And I'd also like to welcome Branimir Rakic with Origin Trail Trace Labs. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer of that company. He's going to be going through the actual blockchain technology itself, what we do, how we do it, demystify that a bit and go through that. I've been working with Branimir now close to 3 years. We bumped into each other in China, and that was a good bump in and a good partnership between BSI and Origin Trail. My name's Dan Pertel. I'm the Group Innovation Director for BSI. I've been with the company about 11 years and have been with the innovation team now for going on 3 years. It's a lot of fun, and we're going to show you some of the stuff that we've been busy with here in this deck. So the agenda today, what we're going to be going through is just what is BSI and innovation about, and talk a little bit about what our roadmap looks like. We'll talk about blockchain solutions. Branimir will break that down for us and go through how we're working with their protocol, and then we'll talk about some actual use cases. So we've got a number of areas that we're implementing blockchain technologies within the company. We'll talk about those, but we're really going to break down one in particular that is live now, which is the Scan Trusted Factory program. And we're actually going to give you a demo of that system. And I think everybody's going to be pleasantly surprised that it's not just about numbers and code and hashes. What you see on the other end of it is really quite impressive, and a very good and trusted way to validate factories, in this case, for this very large and successful organization, and then what's to come on that. So if we move to the next slide, a little bit about BSI. We're a 120-year-old company and the founding member of ISO. Each year we write standards and we conduct certification audits to those standards. So about 3,000 standards per year. 10 of the top 12 most commonly used standards, of which ISO 9000 quality is the most common, would be standards that we lead the creation of. We're a large company. We have about 84,000 clients around the world, and between our consultancy days and our certification audits, we do about 350,000 days a year in more than 150 countries. So audit and certification is in our legacy, as well as the creation of best practice across the businesses that we serve. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about our recent alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there's 3 particular goals of the 7 that we have selected, where we feel this use case really aligns nicely with. So the first one would be SDG 17, Partnerships for Goals. So SCAN is a great example of that partnership. This association, mainly retailers, Western-based here in the United States, and with that, they've decided to compete on the shelves and not compete with trade security and international trade requirements. So they have partnered within this initiative. It's become a best practice within Homeland Security and U.S. Customs. We'll talk a lot more about that, but a great example of a partnership. SDG 9, Industry Innovation and Infrastructure. This is about innovation, and blockchain technology is one of those areas that we are focused heavily on, and we'll dive more into that. And then responsible consumption and production. In fact, just this morning before the call, we were talking about some factories that were highlighted recently by Customs, where they were not going to allow any exports coming from there because of some forced and imprisoned labor associated with that. So SCAN's all about responsible production, and this particular program that we're talking about is a post 9/11 program, very relevant this week. And it is about checking the security status of those companies so they can have expedited throughput time shipments as it relates to global imports into the United States. So it is about checking those factories and really knowing who we're dealing with over there. Next slide. We'll talk about BSI's innovation purpose just for a little bit, but innovation is really the creation of an unstated need, something that we know that we need, or don't know that we need, but we do need. We focus on that. We focus on solving our clients' both stated challenges that they have and unstated, and we focus around two different areas within innovation, trust and resiliency. We consider this blockchain solution and the blockchain solutions that we have as an instrument of trust, as well as we focus a lot on resiliency. Good example of resiliency would be what BSI is doing from an immersive audit perspective and immersive solutions. We've created and different levels of immersive solutions, level 1 through level 4, and we've conducted 60,000 immersive or remote audits really since the beginning of this year. And with that, many companies are able to keep supply chains moving or obtain those necessary certifications that they have to have in order to really stay in business. So with the focus areas, you'll see on the next slide, what we're really working on are a few different areas in themes. The first would be digital assurance. And from a digital assurance perspective, we're really trying to determine what the next generation of audit and consultancy looks like at BSI. Within there, we'll talk about blockchain services. So we've got 3 different use cases that we'll mention lightly. We'll dive deep into one today and focus purely on the supply chain. But there's other areas of digital assurance that we're obviously very focused on too, including our remote solutions, having an augmented reality platform, one that can be used by the clients or one that's used by BSI on our clients is something that we're very focused on. Continuous assessment as well, so where we can be predictive is really the general area that we're moving into. So the next major theme would be predictive analytics, and with predictive analytics, connecting to a client's API, robotic process automation or audit bots, things that are manual, repetitive, and something that you can put a technology in. That involves being connected through IoT devices. But once you have a connected client, you have these things actually assessed within a factory, an office environment, you could start to apply artificial intelligence and data lake those and come up with some different analytics. And instead of seeing a nonconformity on a certain day within a certain year in a factory, you might be able to continuously assess that to see how compliant that factory is overall from a quality management system, trying to improve the business of our clients. And that's one of the big focus areas that we're working on. Lastly, smart content is really a tailored client experience as it relates to the standards that we have in different digital ecosystems that we're operating in. But it could be that they only need a paragraph of a standard instead of the full standard, and a paragraph in 30 standards instead of buying out 30 standards. So we're working with our knowledge solutions team to try to come up with different smart content solutions for our clients, and there's some exciting development in those areas. But this is the focus of innovation. And onto our next slide, I think what we're going to do now is jump into a poll. And if you can go ahead and answer this, but does your organization currently use blockchain technology? And we've got 3 options there. As that starts to fill out, we'll go ahead and I'm going to pass it over to Branimir at this point once we go over the results. But Branimir, we've been working with for a while in the development of these different use cases, and his company Origin Trail in Trace Labs, he'll go over the formation of that. But what we'll do is we'll take a peek at the actual technology itself. So again, a pretty high number. We did this webinar last night with the APAC region, and I believe they were 25% are using blockchain technology. We're at 23% here, and 41% are unsure if they would like to use it. 36% are no, but would like to. So very consistent with last night. I think it was about 2/3 of the attendees either were using it or wanted to use it. So with that, it's a good introduction to our next section, which is actually going over the technology itself. So Branimir, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everyone. This is Branimir. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Trace Labs, and we will be talking today a bit more about how blockchain works. I'll try not to go too technical, so that because if we do that, we can talk for a very long time. So I'll try to keep it very high level and explain how we implement blockchain in the solutions together with BSI. So one of the key questions here is, what is it really used for? And we should really start from the key promise from the start is actually how we manage data in an environment where there's multiple parties. So can we go to the next slide, please? So essentially, if we look at the way we keep records, if you have one organization or if you're one individual, it's kind of a solved problem in a digital world. But if you have multiple parties sharing some sort of information, you kind of can go 2 ways. You can either go with something called a centralized ledger, which is maintained by one body, a central body, and which is essentially a middleman, which has all the trust placed into them and has the ability to change and even manipulate this information. This is sort of the traditional way we've been seeing data managed and shared across organizations. The novel way is really going the decentralized route, so having a decentralized ledger, which essentially goes to the path where everybody has the ability to keep a ledger, everybody within this system, and we'll touch upon that, on what that means in a few. But essentially, the idea there is that we're moving away from a centralized place where data is being kept and managed. So that means all the participants in a certain network get to keep a ledger or information, and the trust is no longer within one particular entity, but rather with the network mechanisms. So that means essentially mathematics and cryptography. There's a really great property coming out of this, which is actually data immutability, which I'll explain in the next slides. But essentially, what this also comes with is another property that such a system is much more resilient to problematic events. So rather than a system that's maintained by one organization in a centralized manner. So systems like Bitcoin today, for example, can survive even catastrophic events, such as some people even like to mention asteroid hits. But anyways, what's important to realize is that the decentralized ledger is basically a ledger being maintained by multiple parties, and that it has the properties of immutability and that it's very resilient. How immutable is it? Well, let's go to the next slide and look into it. So what we really get is we get something called blocks, and it's really not really so important to understand why we do this in blocks. It's really that certain amounts of data are being hashed together. That's an operation, that's a cryptographic operation, which is illustrated on the left on the slide. So for an input value, like cat or a sentence, a white cat is outside, you can produce something called a cryptographic hash, which is an output, and you can see that on the right side of that table, which is basically an array of characters and numbers that is quite unreadable by a human being. But what it can be used for is to verify that a certain value has actually been indeed been used to produce this hash. So that means using a hash function on the value on the left will always produce the value on the right. If by chance you would change the value, like let's say the word cat gets an additional S and it becomes cats, the value on the right will no longer be the same, it will completely change. This might not sound too intuitive, but it's actually very useful, because in this way we can prove that a certain piece of data hasn't been changed, because we can always hash it again and compare it with a hash that someone might have made prior to us actually getting the data. Why is this useful in blockchain? Because that lets us validate every historical piece of information, or block in this case, to verify that it hasn't been changed, and that means the information within it has integrity. What's also very important to note about hashes are two things. One, that it's a really one-way operation, so you cannot take the output value and somehow out of it figure out the input value, so you cannot really get cat from the string on the right. But you can very easily get the other way, so you can always very easily hash the input and get the output. That's one thing, and actually the other, the impossibility of other is really theoretical. There is a theoretical possibility, but that would mean that a computer would have to run for around thousands of years to actually guess what the input was. So that's why the blockchain has a very strong property of security as well, because if you have hashes stored on the chain, it's very hard to understand, to actually get what the initial value out of it was, or to actually crack this input information. With additional components to this technology regarding networking and some other additional elements, what we really get is basically an immutable ledger that's stored and synchronized constantly across the globe between all network participants, and that's really useful from the data integrity perspective. Moving on to the next slide. I'd like to just point out a few key promises of the blockchain technology for supply chains particularly. So in particular, it was very interesting from the perspective of having all these systems run by different entities and stakeholders in the supply chain communicate through this common ledger in a common business language because of this promise of interoperability. Obviously, the data integrity comes with the immutability property that I already mentioned. And an additional component there is actually having verifiable digital identities as a component of the ledger, because every stakeholder that actually interacts with the ledger has to provide, has to interact with it using a verifiable digital identity. That would mean that one can identify a certain transaction with its specific cryptographic identity. These promises are very, very interesting, though. In the reality, there's a couple of issues with the technology, and one of the main issues that probably many of you have heard of is actually the issue of scalability. The problem there is that essentially the whole world tries to maintain one ledger, and because there's a lot of communication overhead, physics really become the bottleneck, in that sense that it's really hard to put a lot of things on this ledger in a sort of in a very fast way. So that's why some of the biggest blockchains today, such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, only have a very small number of transactions per second they can actually process. So in that sense, blockchains are not very performant in terms of working with a lot of information, a lot of data. But because of this property of being very sort of constrained in a bottleneck sense, they actually have this property of high security. So what this implies really is that in order to handle a lot more data, it makes sense to use blockchain in a very minimal way. And that's why I'm going to explain today to how we as Trace Labs have been working with blockchain for the last several years. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to introduce actually a notion of a decentralized knowledge graph, which is another key technology that we are utilizing together with blockchain in order to move towards the vision of actually having something such as Google for supply chains. The idea being that you can look up any sort of important information just as you can today in Google, and to on a particular object in a supply chain, company, document, or whatever might be the object of interest, and to get a verifiable history of it in terms of this being on a decentralized ledger. So what does this really mean? I'm just really quickly going to introduce the principles on how we're actually building this technology, and then I'll explain the details of it and how it interacts with blockchain. So moving on to the next slide, just to introduce the notion of the direction such a new piece of technology needs to be built is that essentially needs to be built so that it inclusively enables all organizations, small and big, to benefit from these trusted data exchanges. So this is our core belief at Trace Labs, and that's what we believe is the only thing that is actually going to move supply chains towards this vision of Google of supply chains. And if we move over to the next slide, this is how we do it. We essentially have a trinity of principles. The principle of neutrality being the principle embodied within the Origin Trail protocol, which is an open source technology being built exactly to host this decentralized knowledge graph, as well as built on top of blockchain as the integrity technology underneath. It's being utilized by many organizations today already, and it's being developed in a community manner. Also within the Trace Labs as the company, we focus on usability, which is another pillar. So such new technologies really need them to be closer to the users. So that's why we're both working on implementations as well as making them easier to implement and understand. And then finally, the principle of inclusiveness, which is really embodied in the Trace Alliance, an organization which is really a community and a knowledge sharing hub connecting over 100 organizations today, building on top of a blockchain and Origin Trail protocol. What is the Origin Trail protocol? If we move to the next slide, I'll really quickly explain it. Essentially, it's what makes Google for supply chains possible. So the idea is building decentralized applications of a stack of blockchain and a decentralized knowledge graph. Essentially, the problem of scale that the blockchain cannot handle in terms of data, or at least an open permissionless blockchain is not able to handle in that sense, is actually covered by the data layer of the Origin Trail network. So it can handle a lot of actually highly structured semantic data, which is embodied within several important standards, specifically for supply chain. These are GS1 standards and W3C standards for data exchange. This is also a layer 2 network, so essentially all the participants in the network are able to exchange communication and communicate with each other without a central authority. And finally, it's a permissionless network so that anyone can join it and exchange and look up information from other companies or participants in the network. It ensures data interoperability, breaking down data silos and preventing vendor lock-in because of its neutral properties. Finally, because working with blockchain, it actually enables fully verifiable data integrity for each historical piece of information shared on the network. How does the decentralized knowledge graph work? If we go to the next slide, we have an illustration explaining it really quickly. So very often with these decentralized knowledge technology, decentralized ledger technologies, we have a dichotomy of public and private networks, or public and permission networks. And essentially what ends up happening is that you either get a permission network which is shared among a few companies or a consortium, but again also becomes another walled garden for itself. And then we have public networks that anyone can really join, but they have issues of scale. And with both of them, they're both applicable in certain areas, but essentially what we really need is sort of an analogical the way to the way we have networks built out today. So particularly private networks within organizations, and then networks that such as the internet that connect organizations and that we use for services such as even this webinar today. That is how the decentralized knowledge graph essentially operates on top of graph data. So there's a shared public decentralized knowledge graph that every node that is part of the network can consume, read, and contribute to. But also each organization gets to have their own private subgraph, which might be information that they only want to share to certain parties or just keep within their own domain and not share with anyone, but it is still verifiable with the same principles of the graph technology as the public graph. That would mean that if, let's say in this example, organization A would send a certain piece of information from their private subgraph A to organization B, once they share this information, not only does the organization B get to see this information, they also automatically get the information connected in the right place in the graph. And this is done via verifiable cryptographic operations, so that in that sense, we actually are able to facilitate the growth of this graph every time there's an exchange of information happening between organizations. Because of this, you can actually perform very interesting searches within the graph. And these searches are something that very similar to the way Google actually operates, because Google as well has a knowledge graph underneath the hood anytime you make a search on the Google search engine. So why is this important? If we go to the next slide, what really we should sort of keep in our mind is that data in this case is really sort of a raw material. It's growing exponentially. It's currently residing in a lot of different legacy systems, and it's being collected by organizations sort of on an individual basis. And in order to get from data to information, we need to start connecting it. So that's where Origin Trail Protocol comes in with the decentralized knowledge graph, as well as the underpinning blockchain, which enables integrity to the graph, on top of which we're able to build knowledge by actually using this information and putting it in a application context, in a context of a decentralized application. And today we're actually going to see one of those, which is the Trusted Factory application we've been working on together with BSI. Finally, moving towards the upmost layer, which is the wisdom layer, where all these applications together form a large decentralized knowledge graph where you can essentially envision a Google for supply chains. This is really the sort of the highest level that we can get to, but it's really built on the raw material of data that already exists today. To finish off the blockchain aspect, just to underline the discussion here. So the value proposition of the technology are that it brings not only integrity into information, but with this particular stack, it also brings interoperability and interconnectivity of information. And that's what we've been utilizing in these several use cases that we'll be discussing that actually provide the substrate technology to actually build verifiable information and showcase it through the internet and verify its integrity. So that's it from my end. I guess we can continue later with the questions. Right, back to you, Dan, right?
Yes, that is. Thanks very much, Branimir. All right, so we've went through the technical aspects of it, and we're going to show the actual use cases that we've done. And I know the data can be a bit scary in terms of the process, but I think the output is very clean and simple when you look at it. There's three use cases that we'll talk about today where blockchain technology has been used within BSI. The Scan Trusted Factory program is the first one. This is a live program which incorporates different completed audits from 7 different certification bodies, which is then put into the Supplier Compliance Manager solution. It is risk-based. Shelley will go over those different components that Scan uses and weights differently in order to have a risk-based approach. We then put it into the blockchain, and the data viewers can be different. So obviously Scan can use this, and they will go ahead and they will look at it, but they can also invite different government organizations or different associations to see it. This is a permissioned blockchain, so within this particular blockchain, you have to have user rights to get in here. If we're sharing this information with other government bodies, such as the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program, in that case, they will have login credentials where they can see it too. So blockchains can be both open, and the Google for supply chain, as Brandon said, or it can be permissioned, and this is our one permission blockchain base. We also train a number of people each year. Over 200,000 people attend different training courses with BSI each year, and we will certify them to different programs such as ISO 9000 Lead Auditor. Those credentials can be compromised and false claims made against that. Typically what happens is somebody, a future employer, will call to see, in this case, if Susie has completed a certification course, and what we've done is we've entered that into the blockchain, we've converted it into a QR code, which they can post on their resume, CV, or within their LinkedIn profile, to where their credentials are instantaneously validated via blockchain technology. And lastly, we have standards, proof of ownership. So in this case, in many countries, in order to get a construction project from the local government, you have to show that you have a copyrighted version of that standard that you own. This is very hard to prove, so we've turned that into a blockchain solution too. And all of this with the QR code to where it's very easily validated on the fly for either future governments that are trying to employ a company or employ a person, and those credentials are needed. So these are the three use cases that are live with us right now. If we move to the next slide, actually how we're seeing supply chain trust and traceability issues is a bit differently. So we have several issues where different trust mechanisms are being compromised. COVID is a very good example of that. So we're seeing fraudulent COVID-19 antibody tests. The N95 masks are pretty prevalent in terms of counterfeit N95 masks everywhere. And N95 masks typically do have different certifications associated with them. It could be a CE certification. It could be something from the US. OSHA will have different certifications associated with that. So when it comes to trust, you need an instrument of trust to go ahead and validate that product, that person, that entity. And as we see it, these different key use cases, transparency, consumers demand it. Consumers want to know that the actual product that they're buying is authentic, that it's actually not expired, that it's being sold in the intended market. And we have to provide a mechanism to provide that transparency to consumers or to clients, business to business. Traceability is another key area where we see blockchain technology fitting in nicely as well. So with traceability, people want to understand where the origin of that good is, and then the chain of custody, where it's actually moving to and through in order to get to the end location. Lastly, counterfeiting activity and product authentication is another great area for the use of blockchain technology, and we have active use cases in each of these at BSI. But if we really drill down on one, if on the following slide, we can give you an example of traceability. Before we go there, let's get to our second poll question. So what kinds of supply chain trust issues does your organization currently face? And again, transparency is being connected to the consumer, giving the consumer the ability to go ahead and identify something, validate that it's authentic, and this would be a transparency issue that we see quite prevalent. Traceability, product origin, chain of custody would be the actual flow of goods for different government compliance programs. And then counterfeiting issues would be if you've got a product that you either manufacture or that you purchase that is counterfeited, or then just other issues. So if you can go ahead and fill that out, we'll see what the results look like here shortly. Again, very similar to last night, traceability is coming up as one of the top use cases at 38%. That's followed by transparency, giving consumers the ability to go ahead and validate, authenticate that something is actually real. Counterfeit, a lot less than last night with the APAC region, understandable at 8%, chain of custody 8, and other issues are 21. Great. So next slide, with that as a backdrop, what we're going to talk about now is traceability. So, and here's another use case that's active with BSI that we're working and have already gone through the first stage. But this is really around the origin of raw materials. In this case, it's an example of a whiskey supply chain from grain to glass. What we're doing is we're looking at the different manufacturing processes in the distilling process, as well as the origin of that product. So taking it from the farm, malting, distilling, all the way to the bottling. So this is a good traceability use case. Multiply that times thousands of supply chains, and you can see how this can get very complex for some companies. But this is a good example of where traceability would actually be very important. And then I would say transparency. So giving consumers access to the actual origin of that bottle, origin of the supply chain, and those related goods. So it's really where different blockchain use cases start to come together. So if we move to the next slide, what we're going to talk about next is jumping into the use case, the Scan Trusted Factory. And if we introduce Scan on the following slide, this is an association that BSI has been working with since 2015. They have a board of directors that's comprised of senior executives, trade, compliance, security from different retailers across the US. So Lisa Schulte is our current chairperson of the association. She's senior director of trade at Target Corporation, a very large US retailer. And Jennifer Kisner is a trade director at Newell Brands. So Rubbermaid, as an example, would be one of those companies and that family of brands that she manages. Home Depot, Walmart, you can see a lot of companies, largest retailers and importers into the US are part of this. Scan formed back in 2015 because really with the goal of eliminating supplier fatigue, audit fatigue with that. And with that, 1 week, Home Depot may be in that factory conducting a CTPAT security assessment or a social responsibility assessment. The next week, it could be Target, Walmart, or Canadian Tire, and so on. So with that, they got together. They created a standard, a set of criteria rather, as it relates to CTPAT and AEO, so a international trade security requirements. And if once an audit was conducted by the 7 audit bodies that I went over earlier, if Target, Home Depot, and JCPenney use that, then all 3 of those actually would have that information shared within their respective instance. So there's been about 13,000 audits conducted in 74 countries. Each year we add 3,000 to 4,000 new audits with this association. It's growing, it's very popular. We feel that the blockchain program will be attractive to other people, but it's how you go ahead and do it. On the following slide, this is an example of some of the brands that are part of this. So we're up to 45 companies that import about $1.25 trillion worth of goods each year. Again, the largest importers and retailers in the world are part of this association, and they trust BSI to manage this supply chain vetting and security program for them. And really working with these companies, it's a real honor, and it's a great group of people behind it. The following slide, what we'll do at this point is jump into poll number 3. And if you can go ahead and answer this, has anyone experienced a supplier or partner providing false documentation to show compliance? So while you're answering that, this is an area where the SCAN Association has reached a level of popularity where factories want this certification so badly that they're willing to compromise and make false claims. And this is really where one of the blockchain use cases for SCAN came into place. Is we have factories out there that are making false claims and assertions that they have actually been certified, and with that have photoshopped other factory reports and also claiming their factory ID number. So it takes a bit of research right now, or at least among our old system, to go ahead and determine if in fact that factory had a certification audit conducted. And if we could show the results here, what we'll see is 45% are yes. And so last night it was interesting. It was 64%. So it's about half of us between last night's webinar and today's webinar have experienced some form of false documentation. And that's what blockchain is great at addressing, are disproving false claims, and why we call it an instrument of trust. If we move on to our next slide quickly, please. Poll 3, has anyone experienced, excuse me, 4, what methods do you currently utilize to ensure your supply chain meets your compliance requirements? So here I'll just go over some of the solutions. This is multiple choice. Some insert contractual language, and that's all they do. Others send self-assessments out to those factories and try to get some gauge of compliance there. Others have on-site audits that they do, or they'll recognize other program certifications with programs such as SCAN, or TAPA is another one in the supply chain area. Some use blockchain verification with that. We really see this growing in popularity, but if we can get a look at these poll results, we will see, who's using what. Contractual language, no surprise, is 32%, and on-site audits, 32%. Again, the most popular program certifications at 26. So 0 with blockchain verification. Very interesting. I think APAC is probably out in front of other markets in terms of the adoption of blockchain verification. Last night was about 25% with blockchain verification here within this audience, within, call it US largely. In Europe, we're at 0%. So with that as a backdrop, I think we can move into the SCAN use case and really starting to talk about that. We, in June, released our Innovation Insights paper. This was for blockchain-based solutions. If you would like to see a copy of this white paper, please reach out to us at the conclusion or in the follow-up email that we'll have in survey within this webinar. But instruments of trust is something that we highlighted on, and this is where I'll introduce now and pass it over to Shelley Shervin, who's the program manager of the Supplier Compliance Manager tool. And her and Branimir and team really worked on developing this trusted factory blockchain program. So Shelley, over to you for the demo.
Perfect, thank you, Dan. So a couple things I wanted to reiterate. Dan did a great job of showing some of the examples and reasonings behind why blockchain is so important when it comes to some of the polling questions that we had just asked. So just to reiterate, in the last 5 years, the program, the SCAN program has successfully and significantly grown in popularity, membership, and not only the audits that have been conducted annually, but also that we have over 13,000 audits in our database today. I bring this back up because due to the popularity here and their audit concept, there has been an increasing number of requests over the years by non-SCAN members to participate in this program, some legitimately wishing to participate and others not so much. Factories inquiring about how they can preemptively receive an audit and share the results with the overall membership before they receive a request by SCAN shows that they too see value in this program. This is a very positive move towards the goal of reducing audit fatigue and really growing that force multiplier for the program's value. Now, to think back to that polling question, have you ever received false documentation to show compliance? Like many things that have been counterfeited, audit results as well as associated compliance documentation are not immune from this fraudulent activity. Audit reports can be mimicked, documents forged, all in the hope that someone may be too busy to work through all the channels to try and manually validate that information provided. This can be mitigated by leveraging a digitized blockchain ledger. So as we move forward through the trusted, scan trusted factory workflow, I felt this was important to kind of talk through the steps that the Scan Association has gone through to really try and build a trusted program. So the certified auditors, only approved, scan authorized, trained service providers may conduct audits for this program. They undergo annual training and are issued audits on a rotational basis, avoiding being issued an audit in a back-to-back format at any facility and providing equal distribution to the 7 firms based upon regional availability. The compliance section here, all audit assignments to the service providers and the corrective actions to the factories are facilitated through SCM, the Supplier Compliance Management System, managed by a program management team that is agnostic of any of the SCAN member companies. Underneath the data provider section, the audit statuses, completed audit and corrective action key elements, and a copy of the report are available within the SCAN repository for permissioned authorized SCAN members to access this information. This allows for the audit program transparency and monitoring by the membership. The Origin Trail Decentralized Network, here's where selected audit information from the repository is shared to a private node. This is where the sender of the audit data is verified and validated, as well as the audit information to ensure data integrity and trust. Think back to what you heard Brandon discussing earlier and how he explained the multiple level of securities that this involves. Underneath the audit report section, there are 2 ways of accessing the Scan Trusted Factory blockchain portal. One is via a completed report, where a user may use their phone or a tablet to scan the QR code that was added to help add another validation level. Even through the phone scanning this code, the user will still need to be an authorized SCAN member to access the SCM system to get to the blockchain information. The other way to access the portal will be through the SCAN repository, which we will see here momentarily in the demo. The data viewer section is similar to the SCAN repository today. The SCAN Trusted Factory blockchain portal is restricted to only authorized SCAN member companies. The advantage here with the way that this has been organized, later when the association is ready, we will be able to create different permission levels to allow others to also have access to the blockchain information at varying degrees. As SCAN continues to mature, other mutually recognized government programs, such as DTPAT, could have access to the blockchain factories, potentially resulting in reduced exam rates on these factory imports. So now that we have that basic understanding, let me go over into our demo. So here we are going to be logging into the SCAN repository. So upon logging in the repository, the SCAN member can search by factory name or by a SCAN ID. They can also pull up a list of all the all the locations that they have that have been already associated with their member company. So this list would populate, showing and allowing the member to monitor the status of all audit requests that have been made. And they can see all this different information that's provided here, showing different audit scores, the status of the audit, who people are assigned to, and whether or not it was assigned by themselves or by another member company that also shares that same location. So since we're talking about how to access, the blockchain, we are going to look at and see who is able to already have their information available within there, which is indicated by the blue highlighted, validate buttons. So when I click on this, it's going to bring up us access into our private node for the blockchain for SCAN. Okay, so over here on the right-hand side, this is the information that we were talking about that Brandon was going over in great detail. So the validation here is that we can first see that the audit issuer, who is BSI, has been identified and validated that it was the one who issued the data. BSI's identity is verified in the Ethereum blockchain. So once it goes through that, it'll continue to move down to the data of the information of the audit that has been processed. So this is verified, making sure that the audit data has not been tampered with, changed, or altered in any way, and comparing the digital fingerprint of that data in the interface to the one that's secured on the blockchain. We'll also scroll down to see if any of the data has been revoked. If it all turns out well, then you will see that the audit is validated and that the date is stamped at the bottom. The users at any time here can go ahead and re-click on any of this information and have it run again. So when they do that, it'll just continue to show all the different steps that are taking place and the line will continue to populate and move through the process after it has, come through that data again. So you can see the line continuing to go through. Data has been verified, the issue has been verified, revocation status has been okay, and look at its audit has been validated and the data has been updated to today. Okay, so as we continue to look over here on the left-hand side, I'm a very visual person, and we were looking at ways to try and make the information a little bit more appealing and easy to read through. So those different 10 key data points that have been brought over to the data blockchain has also been augmented with a few other key pieces of information. So we can see the name of the security audit, the factory that this pertains to, when the audit was completed, as well as the audit status, because there are a couple different statuses that could be relevant here. So when the audit first gets completed within the SCAN program, it gets shared to the blockchain, but it also has to then undergo and go through CAPA process. So you may see a couple different statuses here until it has reached the reviewed complete status. The audit number is present here, as well as the auditing company who did the audit. So we continue to scroll down a little bit further. We can see some other interesting information along with the geoplotting of where the factory is located, the country in which they are operating out of, and what their average score was, compliance, in comparison to other factories within Chile that have also completed the audit. So we can see here that the factory is at 94%, which is above the average for everybody else here in Chile who's completed the audit. We can then benchmark it against everybody else in the program that has completed it. So then we see that the average for the overall program is at 95% compliance. So this particular factory fell just a little bit short here. We can also see, if we wanted to dig a little bit deeper, we have the availability of seeing the categorical breakdown. So this is just a little bit of a deeper dive to see from all the different sections that have been very important to the organization to be able to see and drill down where are there some opportunities for improvement. We can also see here that the overall risk index for this particular factory is deemed at a low rating. So this is really pulling in a combination of the algorithm that SCAN has decided to leverage here. So we're pulling in a mixture between compliance score as well as geographic risk. The geographic risk elements here that they are taking into consideration are terrorism, unmanifested cargo disruption, introduction, as well as cargo disruption. So you can see Chile has some different levels here that are relatively on the lower half of the 5-point scale. Always more information you can click on and read and see what other information is relevant for this particular country as it relates to these different topics. So we continue to scroll down a little bit further. We can see a couple other key pieces of information that's important to include within the blockchain. So again, we have the company name, the unique SCAN ID that's been assigned, the city and country, some years in business, as well as the employee number and whether or not they have a certificate or any sort of approval program within CTPAD or any other global AEO program. The last couple things I'd like to be able to leave you with is that there are some takeaways that this particular page can provide you. We can click on the Share PDF, which is very nice as it summarizes on one page a report that you can share with upward management or other people who are making key business decisions. It has everything here right now, one nice view that you can download into a PDF, or you can share it electronically to any of the members of your team. The other great concept here is it's got direct access to the full report. So you can look at and see all the different findings that the auditors found for that particular on-site audit. So again, it's showing you everything. Front cover page has been set up so it can be a great, certificate that the factory utilizes, along with our QR code. And as we continue to scroll down, you get to see more location details, the pre-CAPA and post-CAPA scoring, any improvements that were made, all the business profile detail information that was collected, as well as all the audit responses, including any supporting documentation that you can have access to be able to understand what it was the auditors were looking at to be able to do their evidence of documentation. So that summarizes our demo really quickly here for you. As we continue on to the last slide here, just wanted to be able to leave you with some lasting thoughts, to wrap up, the SCAN Trusted Factory Blockchain Program. SCAN has a trusted and verifiable audit program that has shown considerable growth over the years, providing in-depth data to produce valuable key metrics that helps drive program enhancements, making the supply chain more secure, as well as helping it to be considered a best practice by the customs program for CTPAT. The Scan Trusted Factory digital blockchain has been structured in such a way that it will allow for growth and expansion capabilities to generate more traceability within the supply chain, as well as furthering legitimate trade. We know that information cannot stay siloed. This portal has great potential to include future concepts such as documenting sustainability compliance for the factory and/or training certifications for the associated service providers. Allowing other mutually associated organizations or government entities to have access can also be a consideration to help continue with new levels of transparency should the association choose to go down this path. With that, I'd like to hand it back over to Dan now. Appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. That was a great review, and hopefully, you see the user interface with that. It's a lot less scary than trying to understand, all the official terminology and technology associated with blockchain. I think it's a good interface. We have a few questions, and if anybody has a question, please, over on the right, go ahead and fill something out in the chat. We have time to get through a few of these. The first one, Shelley, is what else is BSI considering for blockchain use cases? Are we doing or dabbling in any other area? Maybe you could talk about what's next for you and the Scan Trusted Factory program.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So this is actually very exciting. So we are already working on a phase 2 for Scan that's going to incorporate an additional level of trust and transparency around the service providers. So we talked about having, all of the service providers undergo training, but we want to be able to tie and pull that into this particular blockchain view. So anybody who is pulling up that blockchain, verifying the information, they will also be able to see that the auditor at the time who completed this audit also has a valid certification, since all auditors must undergo an annual certification training. So they'll be able to see that information as well, real time. The other piece that we're looking at is trying to get access for CBP to have a limited view of the information, when they access the portal. So that'll be part 2 and phase 2 that will be coming out later next year. Other conversations have been had with several other organizations. They are really excited what they've seen so far with this particular program. And we've got about, I think, 2 other associations that we've been talking to that are really anxious to look at this as part of their next step in their program process as well.
Thanks, Shelley. So, Shelley, just a quick follow-on to that. You were one of the first really jumping into this. What's your takeaway?
So I'm super excited about it. I was one of those individuals that, needed to see something visual. And this has really made it real time for me. And I think this is really exciting to be able to see the leverage just in the short month that this has been, gone live. We've gotten a lot of really positive feedback on being able to tie this information in there. And knowing that people have tried to fraudulently, mimic some of these scan audits in the past, now we've got really quick tools in place that can, just in a matter of a few seconds, validate the credentials and the credibility of this particular program. So I think putting these tools in place is really going to add power to the Scan membership at large, as well as other associations that are really, liking that particular value, because it's just going to immediately provide satisfaction and understanding and trust in the program.
Okay, yeah. So there's another question that came in terms of how would we apply blockchain technology and program management. I think this is a good program management tool. This is a good example of it, to where, before it took us, doing an investigation to prove false claims. Now we can do it in a second. And so what we're seeing are the number of validations with the Scan Blockchain Trusted Factory program being used daily. So we expect this probably to go up into the thousands each month in terms of validations of these, as well as incorporate into different procurement groups, to where they can very quickly, check the blockchain to see if a factory is, validated and in that, enrolled in that program or not. So I think that's a good example of how you can use that from a blockchain perspective. There's another question, Branimir, over to you. Some more clarification, difference between blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I would just ask you to, maybe comment on what you think the future of this technology looks like.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with the first one. So essentially, cryptocurrency is really just one application of the blockchain technology, and essentially it's kind of a minimal application actually. It's one of the first ones to evolve, but there's many others that can be applied building on top of blockchain as really an infrastructural technology. In terms of cryptocurrency, it's really only living within the blockchain, and the applications we've seen today are really applications that operate together with other stacks of technology as well. But cryptocurrency is really only the get-go, the start, and it's not absolutely even necessary for certain blockchains like the permission blockchains that exist today. It depends on really how the blockchain is structured, but they also provide a quite interesting innovation because there's a lot of very interesting stuff happening in that space, but it's not necessary, and it's just one aspect of blockchain technology. When it comes to what's coming up in the generally as technology matures, we're going to see more blockchains actually interoperating together. There's several very promising projects that are actually being built as we speak. And that's going to even further extend the interoperability and enable the users in the end to extract more value out of the technology. What it really excites me about is that not only will we be able to have more of such great implementations like the one we saw with Scan, there's actually going to be a new trust layer added on top of the data. The data that, like we said, is growing exponentially and towards the direction of knowledge, which is going to be utilized in other technologies that are being very rapidly developed, such as machine learning and AI. And that's where trust is going to be a very important factor, and that's why blockchain is going to bring quite a lot of interesting developments in that space as well.
Okay. Thank you, Branimir. I appreciate it. And I wanted to thank both Branimir and Shelley, my colleagues, for co-presenting this webinar with us. There's a couple questions we don't have time to get back to, but maybe we can follow up with you via email. I realize that we're a couple minutes over. So if you've got any questions for any of us, we'll leave this up here for a few minutes. I realize that people are probably going to be signing off here shortly, but please go ahead and you can ask the questions in the survey that follows this webinar, or if you want to go direct with anybody here. So, be on the lookout for more webinars coming in terms of different BSI disruptive technologies and innovation reviews that we have coming up. We thank you for your participation and wish everybody a safe and pleasant morning or evening. Thanks for attending, and have a great day.